Welcome to, sadly, the final lecture in this wonderful series, from which we all have profited enormously. For those of you who have not yet signed up for tomorrow's symposium, I have very sad news, namely that it is fully subscribed, so you're too late. Which is, I think, is really a testimony to the impression that the talks have made and the importance of the subject. So perhaps for this we should soon open up the symposium registrations for the next instance of the Humanitas Scholarship, which in fact I can announce will be Shi Jing, who's a famous Chinese artist, and so we'll go from strength to strength, if I can say it that way, which is wonderful. Just to remind you, the first lecture that David gave was sort of an overview of 20th century modern Chinese history, a tour d'horizon of the 20th century Chinese literature done in sort of focusing on three major dilemmas, if I can put it that way, of Mara poetry, of the homunculus, and finally Nobel dilemma that sort of petered out. And the second lecture was a fascinating discussion which really focused on it was an investigation of what Shi Jing might mean at one of the most traumatic periods in Chinese history and in Chinese literature, in which Sinophone World stood central. The topic of today's talk is sailing to the Sinophone World. And I'm not going to say much more than to invite David, and I'm sure that we'll have a long discussion afterwards, because, of course, as we all know, this is becoming an increasingly complicated, important, but also contentious topic. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you very much, Hans, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I would like to start my lecture for today with a composite picture with 10 images. And I suppose for those who love modern Chinese literature, perhaps you can identify some of these images. But in the interest of the time, probably I should just go over to introduce to you who they are. From the top left, Gao Hu, who is right now in France. Of course, he is the Nobel laureate in the year 2000. Next to Gao, San Mao, I think probably some of you still remember who she was, the late woman writer who was extremely popular in the 1970s and early 80s. She married a Spaniard, and then the couple moved to live in North Sahara Desert. So she primarily was writing from the perspective of Africa. The third person probably you should be familiar with is Mr. Ma Jian, a Shandong native. In the 80s, he became famous because of his writings about his own Tibetan experience. Then after 1989 Tiananmen incident, he exiled himself overseas, and eventually he chose to stay in this country, the Britain. The next one, Eileen Zhang, the eternal Eileen Zhang, I think everybody loves her. She was based in Shanghai in the 1940s, extremely popular writer for her very decadent view of Chinese historical turmoil. And then 1952, she left China for good. Eventually, she came to the United States through Hong Kong. The one on the top right, Bai Xianyong, I think, again, this is somebody who everybody may be quite familiar with, a Muslim writer, son of one of the most important warlord generals during the Republican period. After 1949, he and his family first went to Hong Kong, and eventually they moved to Taiwan. But in early 1960s, Bai Xianyong moved to the United States and has lived in the United States since then. The lady on the left row, on the far left, Li Zishu, who is a Chinese-Malaysian writer, currently traveling, actually, London, São Paulo, Brazil, actually, Beijing, and Kuala Lumpur. And Dong Qizhang, a writer based in Hong Kong. The lady in the center, Zhu Tianwen, who is an extremely established woman writer based in Taiwan, and she represents the so-called second generation mainland Chinese writer in Taiwan. This lady Yan Geling, who was born in Shanghai, and she actually is still quite active on the scene of literature in China. But she married an American diplomat. So actually, for the past several decades, she has been traveling all over the world. And right now, she's in Germany. And finally, Ha Jin, who was born in Harbin, and he went to the United States in the mid-1980s, majoring in British American literature. After 1989, he chose to stay in the United States and has since decided to create in English. So these writers are prominent names. Actually, I guess most of my audience know at least a couple of the names. But normally, we don't find their names or works in the textbooks in the PRC. When we talk about the modern Chinese literature, these names usually don't come to our mind in the first place. But then, what about this gentleman? This is the pride of Cambridge, Mr. Jin Yong, right? Before 1997, he was regarded as a Chinese language writer living in a British colony. After 1997, well, now he has been more or less enlisted to the canon of Chinese literature. So is there such a kind of magical thing as to how we decide the national identity of these writers? And that is a question we want to look into for the rest of the talk of today. So basically, I'm talking about the two issues. On the one hand, Chinese literature. That's the term we have taken for granted. And we study Chinese literature, we love Chinese literature, and we are talking about Chinese literature on this occasion. But I am introducing a new terminology or new term that is Sinophone literature, or in Chinese, 华语语系文学. And this is a neologism. And definitely this was a term first invented in mid-1990s and then became more and more popular actually over the past decade. And no doubt, when we pronounce the word Sinophone, other associations come to our mind. Words such as Anglophone, Francophone, Hispanophone, or even Nipponophone. So with these phones, right, we immediately are thinking of something more than just merely literary articulations. We are thinking of the general historical, political context, particularly in terms of colonialism and post-colonialism. So no doubt that this particular term, Sinophone, carries the connotation of some kind of a colonial or post-colonial imaginary. But the question is, do I agree with such a kind of definition? That probably will be debated later in today's lecture. But no matter what, we probably want to know in the first place the sort of semi or mild colonial implication of this terminology. Why do we want to invoke a term such as Sinophone or Sinophone literature? Well, haven't we had enough terminologies referring to a whole range of literature produced overseas, either by exiled Chinese writers or expatriate Chinese writers, and so on and so forth? When we take a look at the literary textbooks in the PRC and partially in Taiwan, terms such as this come into view. Terms such as 华侨文学, overseas Chinese literature, that's the most commonplace, particularly before 1949. 华文文学, Chinese language literature. 世界华文文学, world Chinese language literature. But very strangely, this world Chinese language literature does not include PRC literature because there has to be some distinction to be made here, 内与外, interiority versus exteriority. 海外华文文学, similar kind of argument, and 汉语文学, Han Chinese language literature. So why do we still want to invent yet another term, as if these terms are not good enough for us to understand, appreciate the corpus of literature produced outside mainland China in the contemporary era? Well, to begin with, let's just take a look one definition as to what is a Sinophone. And again, Shi Shumei, I'm going to refer to her again and again, one of the most important critics who has engaged with Sinophone studies for more than a decade. And she definitely deserved the credit for the one who has made the Sinophone truly a popular and sometimes contentious subject matter, particularly in the academia in North America. According to Professor Shi Shumei, the Sinophone is defined as a network of places of cultural production outside China. So geographically, this is crucial. And on the margins of China and the Chinese-ness, again, a second interpretation of this geographical and spatial direction, where a historical process of heterogeneizing and localizing of continental Chinese culture has been taking place for several centuries. So here, Professor Shi's point is that she wants to call attention to a phenomenon of literary cultural production that has happened overseas China. So here, this distinction between mainland China versus overseas Chinese communities has been stressed again and again. And then, following that, the second paragraph, the Sinophone, therefore, maintains a precarious and a problematic relation to China, similar to the Francophone's relation to France. Here, Professor Shi just reveals her own agenda. That is, her argument is based upon a kind of a post-colonial intervention with colonial literature called a Sinophone or Francophone or Anglophone and so on and so forth. But again, let me just reiterate my point. Do I really agree with this? We will see. But for Professor Shi, one thing we should definitely pay attention to. That is, when we come to the issue of Sinophone literature, we want to argue that Chinese or Chinese language is not a monolithic discourse. We want to argue that Chinese language is merely one of the numerous articulations or utterances of this huge so-called Sinitic Tibetan language family. Even on the China side, on the Sinitic side, we can already identify more than 100 dialects, poplect, different kind of expressions regarding the Chinese-ness of a Chinese articulation or language. And altogether, Sinitic Tibetan language family comprises more than 400 language expressions. So Chinese or Tibetan or whatever, here we're really talking about the multiple and the plural ways of expressing your experience in this particular area. On the China side, probably we have quite a number of Chinese background, or should I say Sinophone background listeners, and probably you don't always speak the so-called perfect Mandarin Chinese called 普通话. After all, this 普通话 was merely an invention after 1940s. And we each may have some kind of dialect. We may have some kind of toplects we are actually better at. And we actually are mastering a couple of so-called Chinese language all at once. So here, even under the heading of the Sinitic part of a Sinitic Tibetan language family, we can already talk about a kind of a heteroglossia. That is the plural expression of Chinese linguistic experiences. Think about Hokkien, Cantonese, Hakka, Shanghainese, Wu dialogue, and so on and so forth, right? And here, to say nothing of the fact that there are 55 minorities or 55 peoples in China. So supposedly, each of these minorities has its own kind of a way of using its own kind of a linguistic experience for communication. So how do we come to terms with such a kind of a plural phenomenon of Chinese language? That will be the beginning point of the Sinophone discussion. And to support my point, I want to introduce this page. This is actually an official announcement given by the PRC Ministry of Education, the date, September 5th, 2013. The headline is 中国目前仍有4亿多人口不能使用普通话交流. More than 400 million Chinese people still cannot communicate in 普通话. This sounds like kind of unlikely, right? Aren't we always listening to Channel 11, 标准的普通话中央电视台, right? CCTV. And aren't we always watching the same Chinese or Han Chinese language soap opera, 后宫甄嬛传, and so on and so forth, right? We are having fun. And how come the Ministry of Education of the PRC expressed worries about this phenomenon? And the fact is that we may have this very pervasive 普通话 standard Chinese to be circulated, disseminated as it is prescribed by the government. And of course, all the news media, all kind of media terms help facilitate the circulation of Chinese or standard Chinese. But still the fact is that as long as we think of the Sinophone plurality in China, and we cannot help thinking of the multiple languages being used on this land. And no wonder, at the end of the press conference last year, the Ministry of Education, PRC, made it very clear, 发展普通话，共筑中国梦. So that is, again, part of our Chinese dream. We want to have the whole Chinese population to speak the same language. Of course, this monolinguistic control of the population definitely part of a national agenda. It doesn't happen only to China, but still the whole size of the population in China and the very complex system of linguistic expressions in China make this case all the more intriguing and sometimes even contentious for us to think about. But no matter what, to conclude for this part, I'm talking about a kind of a situation of the so-called heteroglossia. This is a term I borrowed from the Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin. And I sort of played on words by changing the color of that 华, 众声喧哗, and I made it a 众声喧哗. This China is always a kind of a heteroglossic China. It's always a China full of different kind of noises, soundings, and so on and so forth. And this Sinophone heteroglossia is not limited only to dialects or toplects, the multiple developments of different kind of local languages. It also should include social dialects. I'm quoting Bakhtin, characteristic group of behavior, professional jargons, generic languages, languages of generations and age groups, tendentious languages, languages of the authorities of various circles of passing fashions. Aren't we always using different languages in communication? When some of the students here spoke to me very, very respectfully, Professor Wang, I need your advice and so on, but you don't talk always like that. When you talk to your boyfriends or girlfriends, you use actually different kind of a language. So here, we're talking about this kind of a so-called heteroglossic development of language, and that's the language which helps generate our imagination and our multiple forms of agency. So for the following, I'm going to develop my argument into 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to quickly introduce the critical genealogy as to the development of Sinophone studies over the past 25 years. In the second part, I'm going to introduce a debate, actually primarily the debate between Professor Shi Shumei on the one hand and myself, David Wang, on the other. And the third part, I'm going to make my own proposal, a kind of a polemic proposal simply for the sake of a discussion. And certainly I welcome your feedback and criticism. So here, part 1, critical genealogy. So all starts with the fundamental question, what is China, right? This is a kind of cliche questions we want to ask again and again when we come to the field of China or Chinese studies. What constitutes the so-called Chinese-ness when we come to the field of sinological studies or China studies? Is China a political entity, either the PRC or the ROC, which is almost a passé now? Whether this is a cultural tradition when we talk about China, 文化传统, or does China represent a historical continuum? It's a kind of continued development of civilizations, of political engagements over hundreds or even thousands of years. Or is China a form of a communal life? We live together, we live in a way we call the Chinese way of living. Or finally, is China a kind of a national imaginary? Is China a kind of a desire, right? And this desire sometimes can be concocted, can be actually facilitated by national machine for a specific purpose. We all have this feeling for some kind of sort of national belonging, particularly in the China case. Think about the Beijing Olympics, think about the Shanghai Expo, and so on and so forth. China there is being sort of foregrounded as the target of collective imagination, or should I even say, collective desire. But for today, I'm not going to cover all these very general questions. Instead, I want to argue that this whole idea about the Sinophone debate or discourse sort of started to take roots in the early 1990s. Again, history is important. And we are talking about post-1989 Tiananmen incident that served as a kind of watershed, as a kind of a divide line for overseas Chinese scholars and writers first, eventually for writers and scholars on the mainland to rethink the question, what is China? So here, a really quick run. We started with Professor Wei Mingdu, who at that time, 1990s, was a professor at Harvard, and of course he, even to date, is a leading scholar of modern Neo-Confucius or Confucian studies. Professor Du offered the idea of a cultural China in 1993, as opposed to the political existence of socialist China. And he argued that maybe we cannot change the status quo of that political entity or that political sovereignty. Maybe overseas Chinese can at least think of a different kind of a collective sort of a communal life we call 文化中国 or cultural China. And of course, for Professor Du, this culture has to be rooted in Confucianism. But again, question has to be asked. Do we have only Confucianism to talk about when we come to the issue of Chinese culture expressions at large? And following that, Wang Gengwu, a Singaporean Chinese scholar who was born in Indonesia and then educated in Beijing and Australia. And then eventually he moved back to Singapore, and right now still a very, very important senior scholar in Southeast Asian studies. He has argued that instead of this kind of overarching vision of 文化中国 or cultural China, we should talk about 实践的中国性, China as a kind of pragmatic engagement with local experience. Wherever you stay, wherever you live, you carry out your Chinese legacy and you make a new interpretation of and adaptation to this Chinese sort of imagination, culture, knowledge, or whatever in light of your local knowledge and experience. The third person, Leo Li, who is my predecessor at Harvard, instead talking about 游走的中国性. That is, this is a Chinese identity always on the move. And Professor Li is a big promoter of Chinese cosmopolitanism. Of course, for him, we always want to take the marginal stance vis-a-vis the mainstream discourse about China. And we want to talk about this marginality as a new privileged perspective from which to view and understand and critique China at the center. So here, this kind of a marginal Chineseness or Chineseness on the move seems to speak to one generation of overseas Chinese scholars' kind of a desire. You don't want to really sort of settle down. But of course, I was always joking that you need a good passport to be a good Chinese on the move, right? And usually you don't want to wait too long in line for this and that visas. So probably a Chinese American scholar is a little bit more privileged with his American passport in this regard. And finally, Professor Wang Lingzhi, based at UC Berkeley. And again, this is someone who started out being a scholar on Mid-Eastern studies, but somehow he was converted to Chinese studies in 1970s. But Professor Wang had his own agenda at that time. He was coming to the United States in 1948, and certainly he grew up in a kind of bilingual and a bicultural circumstances. So he wanted to highlight the fact that for overseas Chinese, we always need to master the so-called structure of dual domination. That you have to recognize your continuously shuffling kind of experience. And particularly, you want to play with your identities in such a way as to really highlight your existence. So these voices represent the first generation of scholars who want to engage with the issue of a Sinophone experience or Sinophone articulations. But basically, they still have that China somewhere in their mind. On this page, however, by contrast, I want to introduce to you a group of younger generation of scholars who now have a very different takes upon what is China or what constitutes Chineseness. Ray Chow, a scholar who was born in Hong Kong, trained at Stanford, currently teaching at Duke University, years ago has already come out to argue about that we don't really buy this idea of a consanguinity. We want to really to work and act against the notion of a Chinese consanguinity. That means 血浓于水. That's a Chinese cliche that we are all a family or the same family because we share the same blood or whatever, kinship and so on. For Ray Chow, identity is not a kind of a priori sort of imposition. Identity has to be continuously debated and has to be continuously redefined in light of changing historical circumstances. That's a very radical kind of a stance now. For Ian Ang, this is even more interesting. She is a so-called Paranakan, a mixed blood, born in the kind of Chinese Indonesian family. And she was actually trained. She had her education in Netherlands, no doubt. There's a Dutch connection here. And then now she's based in Australia as a professor. So again, you can see this trajectory of travel or move in her case. And then Professor Ang argues that I may have a Chinese-looking face, but to begin with, I'm not a Chinese. I am a Paranakan, a Baba, a mix, right? And my education and my living experience have taught me that I want to find my national identity based on my own choice and my own decision. And I don't want just to succumb to this sarcastic questions. This is particularly referring to Ang's own experience in Taiwan one day when she was taking a cab, a taxi. The driver said, "Aren't you Chinese? You look like Chinese," right? Because of Chinese face. But can you speak Chinese? That's usually the second question. 你看起来像中国人，你就非得说中国话不可。But Ian said, well, I happen to be the Chinese who doesn't, who can't, who is not willing to speak Chinese, right? So here, again, you have this very polemical engagement with the so-called inborn sort of native identity. And the final case in point is Ha Jing. As I pointed out just now, Ha Jing decided to stay in the United States on permanent basis after 1989 Tiananmen incident. And after that incident, he decided to create primarily in English. So it's interesting, right? This is a Chinese-born writer. He was actually a member of a PLA, 曾经是解放军, before he came to the United States. And he got his PhD at Brandeis University. And his English is really not that good. After all, this is our second language. But after this traumatic experience of the Tiananmen incident, Ha Jin felt that he just couldn't create in Chinese anymore. And therefore, at the ceremony for his winning the American Book Award, the highest honor of creative writing in the United States, Ha Jin said, I thank English because I have chosen myself to be exiled to English. And this English language has given me yet another life. So again, language here has become something which can be traveling from one identity to another, from one linguistic culture to another. So language doesn't have to be fixed as that internal essential thing anymore. So here I've given you a really quick run of those different soundings in the arena of Sinophone utterances. But this is a sort of a kind of preview of what I'm going to be more serious about in the next 30 minutes. In recent years, actually in recent 5-7 years, we happen to have a couple of books addressing the complexity of the China studies overseas and actually also on the mainland. To begin with, I repeat, Shi Shumei definitely is a leading scholar, really processing the whole agenda of Sinophone studies overseas. And this is a book she published in 2007. And in one-liner, her strategy or her sort of methodology is a Sinophone as a kind of vehicle of resistance vis-a-vis the hegemonic power, the essentialist power of Chinese culture. So I will go back to Shi Shumei later. Perhaps equally, we want to pay attention to Shi Jing, a professor based at Yale University. And she, together with her family, emigrated to the United States when she was only 6 years old. So she primarily grew up a Chinese American. And in the year 2009, she published the book Sound and the Script in Chinese Diaspora. And I'm not going into the details of her argument. Here, I primarily just want to suggest that for her, Sinophone Studies refers to a kind of sort of agency of a governance instead of a resistance. So now we can see the oppositional stances taken by these two lady scholars. On the one hand, we must use a Sinophone as a way to fight back. On the other hand, Shi Jingyuan, in a typical Anglo-American pragmatic tradition, why not we find a middle ground? Why not we find a Sinophone as a way of a kind of a governance? But also, I would like to argue that Professor Ge Zhaoguang, this is somebody who actually is based in the PRC. Actually, I think many of our PRC colleagues and the students and probably know him at least by name. One of the most respectable scholars in Chinese history, particularly intellectual history. 2 years ago, Professor Ge published a book in Chinese, 宅兹中国, Here resides China. His hidden agenda is very intriguing because primarily he sets out to historicize the whole idea of China, how China has come about over hundreds and thousands of years of Chinese history and civilization. So Professor Ge, in this book, traces the origin of China, now with quotation marks, way back to the Zhou dynasty, 2,300 years ago. So for him, China is no longer just merely a given. China, instead, is a kind of a historical knowledge. And this knowledge has undergone transformations generation after generation, till the point China has become identifiable with this political sovereignty we call a China as a nation. So that probably is the gist of his argument. And the other project Professor Ge is also engaging in at this moment, viewing China from the periphery, probably is equally significant. That is, when we talk about China, we no longer just look at China as that kind of essential or essentialist existence. We actually want to take a kind of perspective here, particularly the so-called perspective of the peripheries from those countries or civilizations around China, looking at how this nation, how this civilization has come into existence, has come to change again and again, not just now, but perhaps in the future too. So all these engagements actually have something to do with the prevailing discourse, which now seems to be prefacing by our colleagues, many of our colleagues in China. I think we have heard so much in recent years about we want China to be a 强大的国家. 中国崛起, China is rising, right? 和平崛起, however. And 世界, right? Not just 世界, but also we are 天下. We have to really gain back this grandiose vision of under the heaven. And in the meantime, we have colleagues who have offered the following sort of theoretical interventions with what makes of China, such as a tributary system, kingly hegemony, great commonwealth, and even unification of three orthodoxies. 通三统, 不是一统, 三统. Confucianism, Maoism, and the Deng Xiaopingism. So these are colleagues currently working really hard to really thinking of China as that wholesome, wonderful existence we call our nation. It is also in this context, I'm making a suggestion that perhaps we need a counter-discourse. We need a different perspective from which to reflect upon the tenability and availability of all these models, be it called 国家世界天下朝贡王霸大同 and even 通三统, right? This is why probably yet another rationale for my engagement with Sinophone Studies. And now, part two. We have now two different kind of sort of stances with regard to the theoretical sort of parameters of Sinophone Studies. I will first introduce part one, post-colonialism, and then follow up by introducing, hopefully, the argument about post-loyalism. As I said early on, Professor Shi Jing based her research on Sinophone studies upon the concept of a post-colonial model or agenda. And for her, Sinophone studies, I quote here, locates its objects of attention at the conjuncture of China's internal colonialism. That's one keyword. And Sinophone communities everywhere immigrants from China have settled, second keywords. So basically, she drew her inspiration primarily from Francophone studies. And for her, China, in the first place, ought to be regarded as a huge colonial empire, right? And then, from the perspective of post-colonialism and multiculturalism, we want to challenge this empire. We want to challenge this colonial empire. And how do we do it? At least we have 3 points to make. First, continental colonialism. That is, ever since Qing dynasty, China has become a kind of imperial and imperialist hegemony. China may have not conquered many countries sort of across the Pacific or Atlantic. It's not a maritime empire. But we want to argue that China is a continental empire, a continental colonial empire. If you don't believe it, think about Tibet, think about Xinjiang, think about Mongolia, and so on and so forth. All these regions, either in the southwestern part of the Chinese territory or almost close to the area of Inner Asia. All these regions were in one way or another succumbing to this so-called colonial hegemony of the Qing dynasty. That's the first argument. And secondly, settler colonialism. That is, ever since the 18th century, Chinese immigrants went to particularly Southeast Asia, settled there, and they actually are blamable for becoming settler colonialists. That means that they are, of course, the settlers just arriving on this new land. Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. But they were able to use their capital, they are able to use their violence, and eventually they managed to appropriate the land, property, or other kind of sources of nature from the locals. So this is a kind of a so-called settler colonialism, which according to Professor Shi should be equally criticized and critiqued. And finally, anti or against diaspora. For Professor Shi, once we have come to a new area, probably here, England, for me, America, or wherever, we should try our best to 落地生根, to settle there, right? And we don't want to indulge ourselves in this kind of morbid, everlasting sentiment, so-called diaspora. We shouldn't really imagine that once upon a time, my family came from China. We should simply happily embrace this new cultural and political environment. And this is where our new roots are. And therefore, instead of talking about diaspora, which of course many of you probably understand was very, very popular critical discourse in the 1990s. Instead of talking about diaspora, we want to talk about the settlement, right? So here we have three arguments made by Professor Shi. Do I really agree with her? To be frank, no. Here, and with the Qing Empire is truly a colonial empire. Well, unless you really expand the definition of 19th century colonial imperialism to such a kind of incredible large extent, you may want to talk about China, particularly Qing China, as a colonial empire as defined by 19th century Western capitalist and expansionist kind of project, national project. So here, I feel a little bit nervous about this, to say nothing of the fact that the Qing Empire or Qing Dynasty was established by Manchus. And here, I thought this is a perfect example of a Sinophone kind of entity, right? I thought Professor Shi should have celebrated this Sinophone kind of conquering of the whole Chinese mainland. And the second, the settler colonialism, this is something I would like to endorse. I think that the new immigrants should never give themselves this privileged positions as we are immigrants, therefore we are innocent, we are vulnerable, and so on and so forth. So when the Han Chinese immigrants went to Taiwan, generation after generation, see how much damage they have done to the local aborigines. So we ought to be very self-critical and reflective. But the third, against the diaspora, this is a kind of yes and no. We know that once we have settled somewhere, we call it England or America and so on and so forth, we really want to start our family all over again. We want to have a new cultural system to go by. But does it really have to mean that we just cut off our roots to the past? Would that be easy? Wouldn't it be that easy to just say goodbye to our ancestral, cultural, linguistic heritage? So here, I'm afraid this against the diaspora is a good cause, but probably it has come too handy and too easy. And so, in other words, standing here, I probably can say that I am not ready yet to give up my Chineseness. But how do we define this Chineseness? Or how do we come to terms with Chineseness? That's another question. But again, in the bottom line of Professor Shi's argument is something I feel nervous about. That is, for her, Sinophone Studies should still be based upon a very clearly sort of demarcated kind of a geopolitical kind of imaginary. That is, Professor Shi's project primarily addresses Sinophone production outside mainland China. And she wanted to use the Sinophone as a critical tool with which to resist, to critic, or hopefully to even subvert mainland China, particularly mainland China as a political regime. my observation is this. I understand that this strong oppositional politics. I think she has her rationale, no problem whatsoever. What I'm worrying about is whether this is a kind of a falling back upon the good old traditional post-Cold War geopolitics. That means we draw this artificial sort of geographical line. We want to say China, that's a socialist and communist China, and here Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Macau, Hong Kong, to a certain extent, probably should find some kind of a coalition, solidarity vis-a-vis that power. As I said, after 1997, things have become a little bit kind of prickly. Because before 1997, according to Professor Shi, Hong Kong was a Sinophone community. After 1997, Hong Kong was a sellout. I don't know. But Hong Kong was being handed over back to China, and therefore Hong Kong has to be part of China. So this brings back the difficult question. When we study Mr. Jin Yong, we all love Jin Yong, right? Shall we call Jin Yong a 中国作家 or a 海外华语作家, right? And this is very, very crucial for Professor Shi. Obviously, for Professor Shi, Jin Yong, you cannot study him anymore because he's Chinese, right? We only want to study Sinophone subjects. But then the next question becomes even more intriguing. That is, for Professor Shi, while we don't study Chinese writer based on the mainland, we are allowed, however, to study non-Han Chinese writers from China. Does it make sense to you? In other words, Tibetan writers are still fine. Uyghur or Xinjiang writers are still fine because they are minorities, they are being oppressed by the Chinese government, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we want to side with them, we want to really support them. So here I'm afraid that we have got ourselves sort of involved in this endless kind of a geopolitical cartography business. We still are thinking in a very spatial way, right, of who is who, where is where. And we actually may have overlooked the fact that China is such an immense land, such an immense geopolitical space. And within China, although all these Chinese were holding a Chinese passport when they're traveling overseas, they do not necessarily speak the same language. This brings back my earlier argument about Sinophone. Look at Mr. Jia Pinghua, a writer based in Shanxi. I don't know anybody who has read anything by Jia Pinghua, or anybody has ever talked with Mr. Jia. I bet you can hardly understand what he's talking about because basically he's speaking in Qinqiang, Shanxi 的方言, dialect of Shanxi. And by contrast, Jin Yucheng, who became really popular in the year 2013 for his new novel, Fan Hua, A Multitude of Flowers, and a Shanghai 作家, so he ought to be a Chinese writer. We don't want to study him, right? According to Professor Shi's formula. But again, the question is that Jin Yucheng wrote this novel in Shanghainese, 是用上海话写的小说. So it really requires some kind of foreknowledge of Shanghai dialogue, the Shanghai dialect, so as to better appreciate this beautiful novel. But still, it's quite understandable. It is really a marvelous novel. So cases like this sort of prod us to think whether on China, on this mainland China, there aren't too many different ways of expressing the Chinese experience. Can we also call these writers' works kind of expressions of Sinophone literature? Why do we want to exclude these writers? Primarily just because they are PRC citizens, right? And whether this kind of approach has much reduced the forcefulness and the power of our agenda. And more examples, Huang Biyun from Hong Kong writing in Cantonese dialect the biography of a hooligan. Of the Taiwanese writer Chen Shuyao, who actually uses who actually mimics Taiwanese dialect describing a family saga that happened in Taiwan. So all these multiple expressions in linguistic terms should be brought into our arena for debate, for contention, for discussion. And then finally come to Professor Shi's favorite writers from mainland. Alai, well, we should be able to study him because he is a Tibetan writer. But I'm really sorry, but he's not a 100% pure Tibetan writer. What can we do with that, right? 他是嘉荣藏族, right? This is a Wenchuan. This is exactly where the big earthquake happened a few years ago. So Alai is, a Tibetan writer, but he's a Tibetan writer somewhere not so close to the Tibetan side, but closer to the Han side. So what to do with him? To say nothing of the fact that Alai now is the chairman of Writers Association of Sichuan 省的作协主席. So do we want to study him or not? Right? That's a question. And yet, the ultimate question is someone like Zhang Chengzhi, a Shandong native from a Muslim family. And of course, he actually, some of you probably know this fact, he was one of the namers of Red Guard. 红卫兵, the term was actually invented or invoked by Zhang Chengzhi and fellow students in the year 1966, an ultimate Maoist, even to date. And yet, he is a very pious Muslim. And he actually believes in a special kind of Islamic sect, the Zhehe Renye sect. It's a very radical sect. And to the point, he made this announcement, 我的根在西亚的阿拉伯，不属于中华民族. So how do we describe a writer like Zhang Chengzhi, who by his birthplace, by his passport, is definitely PRC citizen? So all these questions actually complicated Shi Shumei's argument. And as a result, so I feel really we may want to rethink the whole rationale of engaging with the Sinophone literature. And the following will be a kind of very brief description of my proposal. So here, instead of post-colonialism, I would argue for a kind of post-loyalism, a kind of post-loyalist approach to the Chinese-ness, either on the mainland or overseas. Here, I give a definition. The loyalist original, 移民 in Chinese terminology. Try again. In Chinese language, 移民. I'm sorry for the presentation of the screen. I was actually playing with the different kind of 移民. 移民, 移民, 移民. 移民 means immigrant, with that yi as a dispersal or migration. Yi as a loyalist, all right, traditionally those political subjects who claim that they were loyal to a dynasty that is already a bygone political fact. And a yimin, foreigner or estranged citizen of a new land. So, the loyalist originally indicated the political subject out of touch with his times. As a mourner of a past polity and a culture, the term loyalist derives its meaning from the crumbling margins of legitimacy and subjectivity. This is a traditional definition of loyalism. We call it Ming loyalism, 明代的移民, 清代的移民, and so on and so forth. But here, I want to give this terminology a little bit touch of the postism. So post-loyalism, or the post, in post-loyalist, therefore, suggests a kind of liberation from existing confinements of loyalist discourse. In the 20th century or 21st century, we don't talk about this traditional loyalist feeling anymore. This is supposed to be a democratic age, supposed to be a socialist age. We're not supposed to pledge allegiance to some kind of royal family anymore. Probably here still. But anyway, but in China, the post in post-loyalist, therefore, suggests a liberation from existing confinements of a loyalist discourse. The truth, I argue, is not so. The loyalist consciousness perpetuously hints at a vanished space in time, fixating upon a political orthodoxy that may have never been even orthodox. In other words, post-loyalism points to a kind of political fantasy or political thoughts that make those subjects, someone like myself or whoever, either overseas or in China, thinking of some kind of political and cultural orthodoxy, either in the past or anticipatorily in the future. You want to be feeling that you're part of the tradition. If there is no such a kind of tradition or orthodoxy or heritage available, you don't even mind inventing an orthodoxy, heritage, or legacy, so you can really feel comfortable about and you can really feel you want to abide by. In other words, if loyalism refers to a kind of political thought based upon anachronism, always out of joint with time, after the dynasty falls, you suddenly feel you still have this lingering feeling for the bygone society, bygone dynasty. I want to argue that post-loyalism refers not only to this mere sort of anachronistic imagination of the past. Post-loyalism perhaps also propel even post-socialist and postmodernist subjects to think of some kind of a futuristic legacy, orthodoxy, nation, tradition, and so on and so forth, and for which you want to express your love or you want to express your feeling. So here, I want to argue that post-loyalism serves as a kind of a critical interface through which we criticize our own residue loyalist consciousness, through which we want to really reflect upon the tenacious sort of attraction of the past or future in the name of a tradition to us. In the interest of the time, I want to argue only for the part of yi. In Chinese language, this yi min de yi actually has multiple implications. This yi, or loyalism, in Chinese could mean either 失去或弃绝, loss or lack, or it means a remnant, residue, or left over. And more intriguingly, yi, or in another pronunciation, kui, yi min or yi liu, refers to a legacy and a gift. In other words, by arguing for post-loyalism, I want to suggest that in the Chinese experience, in the 19th and the 20th century particularly, colonial imposition never truly happened to the major portion of the Chinese land. And probably we can talk about Taiwan and partially Manchuria as once upon a time colonies of Japan or under the control of Japan or whatever. Other than that, if you really want to use a Western colonial experience to describe the Chinese political experience, particularly through the 20th century, probably it doesn't work that way, right? So why do we really want to stick to post-colonialism? That, for me, is a question. Instead, I want to argue that ever since early 19th century, when hundreds of thousands or even millions of Chinese chose or were being forced to flee China or to leave China to different kind of overseas Chinese communities to settle there, well, they actually voluntarily carried on their own legacy, their own tradition, and their culture. They were really not necessarily forced to transform their linguistic experience from one kind to another. And when you go to Malaysia, when you go to particularly Taiwan or Hong Kong, you still see lots of historical reminders of how the locals try very hard to preserve the tradition handed down by their ancestors. So here, perhaps for me, loyalism, or particularly post-loyalism, makes a better sense for our understanding of the Sinophone experience. But let me try again. Post-loyalism doesn't mean an ideology. Post-loyalism refers to a kind of a critical interface through which we want to examine our political unconscious. We want to examine, reflect upon our kind of sort of cultural fixations. Why sometimes it is so hard to let go of some bygone experiences? Why sometimes we have already settled somewhere and yet still we are not willing to sort of discard our heritage or a legacy in anticipation of a brand new life? Question like this should be asked, so on and so forth. All right? Now, I'm going to use the remaining moments to talk about the third part. I'm going to skip one example here, but I want to make my own sort of critical intervention with this whole paradigm of Sinophone studies. That is, I have juxtaposed two sort of key words here for your thought, particularly for your criticism. On the one hand, we want to talk about the politic of a root, right? 根的政治. On the other hand, this is a kind of a more intriguing. I'm trying to introduce the idea of the poetics of disposition. There's no good translation here, but in Chinese, that is 是. And I will explain right away what that means in my context. My argument starts like this. All along, we have argued about this Chinese-ness, Chinese history, Chinese memory, Chinese imaginary, mostly in terms of the politics of root. And think about all these Chinese expressions with 根 as a part of them. 失根, right? Loss of roots. We are in Cambridge, we are like orchids without roots. 失根的兰花, right? Referring to the Yuan dynasty loyalist expression. And therefore, we want to 寻根, root seeking. And for all these Chinese set phrases, 落地生根, 叶落归根, 斩草除根, 根真蒂固, and so on and so forth. And all these are so convoluted and twisted. So formulating a kind of a sort of a political culture highlighting this kind of deep-seated sort of fixation upon roots, where you come from. And ultimately, Tang Junyi, one of the most important neo-Confucianists in 20th century, 1961, came up with the famous quote, 花果飘零，灵根自植, the drifting away of Chinese cultural flowers and fruits, the self-replanting of one's spiritual root. Right? That means we all want to find our roots wherever we are. We know some kind of spiritual, fantastic roots are there to support us. But, well, at the other extreme of the political spectrum, 35 years before, nevertheless, Lu Xun, however, came up with kind of a different argument. And he said we should denounce, denigrate, reject our roots. And instead of roots, he was arguing for a kind of politics of 野草. 野草根本不深，花叶不美。然而吸取露，吸取水，吸取沉死人的血和肉，个个夺取他的生存。So Lu Xun was trying to suggest that let's go by the philosophy of wild grass at the expense of the so-called roots. Let's get away of it. But either way, still, roots are still serving as a kind of a specter, ever sort of haunting us. And in this country, Stuart Hall, one of the most important post-colonialists, introduced the idea roots and the roots. And across the street, Deleuze and Guattari, the two French scholars, talking about the whole idea of a résumé. That means instead of one sort of a very well sort of developed kind of system of roots, let's talk a rhizomatic kind of formulation of our culture. Very, very French, very anarchist and carnivalesque kind of engagement with the idea of roots. But all these arguments are more or less related to the spatial and a kind of positional association with the metaphor root. Here, I would like to argue, however, maybe beyond the geopolitics and the geopoetics of a gun or root, we want to think about the poetics and the politics of a shi. What is shi? This is kind of difficult for me to explain here in a short time. Let me just try. First, shi means 势力, right? Power, force, historical agency. 历史的大势已去, and so on and so forth. Secondly, shi has a kind of military kind of association, strategy, military strategism, and so on and so forth. And thirdly, very peculiarly, shi has been one of the most important keywords in pre-modern Chinese cultural and aesthetic discourse. When we talk about the painting, when we're talking about the Chinese calligraphy, we talk about 运笔要有势, right? You have to really express yourself through your manipulation and the disposition of your manual power to formulate kind of 势 in your calligraphic exercise or in your sort of a painting and so on. So 势, the third line, refers to disposition, artistic propensity. So here I want to sort of again go back to traditional Chinese literary thought, trying to find new sources of inspiration as ways to rethink the possibilities of rethinking Chinese or Sinophone imaginaries. And this shi in the past few years has been taken up by scholars, this is again, I'm so sorry, a French, François Julien, and the Singaporean scholar Xiao Chi. They both have sort of called attention to this discourse of shi in Chinese artistic and cultural discourse. So shi, in this sense, has both its political implication as well as aesthetic and cultural implication. So, to conclude, if we want to talk about the politics of root as a kind of a position or positioning, as a kind of a spatial management of where you are, right? It always points to the boundary. You always point to some kind of attempt at a cartography. I want to argue that maybe equally we want to pay attention to the poetics and the politics of disposition and the propensity. 是的诗学, and it's a kind of momentum. It's a kind of agency or capacity. With this agency and capacity, we traverse geographical boundaries. Like as we travel all the time through internet world, we actually visit different kind of spaces, and we actually are thinking of China always already in multiple senses. We want to really highlight this kind of poetics and politics of propensity, waiting for the right moment, 蓄势待发, or 因势利导, following the trend of the agency, or to make good use of a certain kind of agency and a force to carry out our agenda. Instead of Shi Shumei's kind of a strategy to take China head on or face on, I want to argue that as a literature person, we cannot go out of campus to engage in revolution tomorrow. Instead, we still go back to our text, or our textual site. We still study and we still look at our textual evidence through which we discover and we generate and we prepare different kind of forms of propensity or agency or force in anticipation or different or better China in the future decades or future the generations to come. Now, conclusion. I would like to conclude today's examination of the Sinophone Studies by asking 5 questions. I don't really have the definitive answers yet, but this 5 questions may be, again, starting points for us, for our continued sort of engagement with the Sinophone issues. First, the spatial polemics and the politics. Whether it's Sinophone literature versus a Chinese literature refers again to this kind of a simple, simplified, dichotomous sort of a diagram. Exclusion or inclusion, exteriority versus interiority, diaspora versus settlement, hostility versus hospitality, or resistance versus governance. I don't think the simple answer can be available. I think we definitely need to use our imagination and our intellectual engagement to truly create a new kind of a form, new kind of a shi, in my terminology, to make the whole study much more complex. And the Sinophone articulations. We talk about the soundings. We're talking about this acoustic effects of Chinese. But what about the inarticulate articulations? What about non-Sinitic articulations? Is Ha Jing, who writes in English, part of the Sinophone World? Question like this. What about the ellipsis? What about silence? Thinking about Liu Xiaobo, who is now putting into silence. Isn't that also a kind of a Sinophone sort of articulation we want to think about? And the third, on the human condition. Sinophone studies shouldn't be limited merely to what I describe as a post-Cold War politics. Unfortunately, I thought Professor Shi is still thinking about 他们跟我们, 海内跟海外, and so on and so forth. I think that's way too simplified. I want to argue, however, the human condition applies to class, to gender, to ethnicity, to even to psychiatrical conditions, both on the mainland and overseas Chinese communities. And all these overseas communities do not necessarily always form a kind of solidarity vis-a-vis that big China. We want to diversify our attention. We want to look into the human condition as such. Fourth, media and mediality. Different kind of forms of artistic expressions point to different kind of medial conduits of expressing our Sinophone experience. And the fifth and the last, where is the historicity of Sinophone studies? For me, at this moment, seems to me we have put too much emphasis upon the Sinophone condition after 1949, as if Chinese history didn't start till that year. I want, however, to open up the whole historical sort of scope to look into, in a kind of a retroactive way, different kind of possibilities of understanding Chinese history from a Sinophonic sort of perspective. With this sort of agenda in mind, I probably then can say I look forward to a very prosperous development of Sinophone studies in the years to come. Thank you.